computer. Okay, and if the rest of you all hit your mute buttons, that will give us a little clarity when we get started. If you just unmute yourself when you want to jump in and say something. So, so really, we got people 1, 2, 3. Yeah, we have 4 different cities on today, which is kind of interesting. We'll have more people joining in as we get going on the evening, but it's a warm Wednesday night in San Marcos, Texas, which is cooled off apparently because it rained, and I didn't know that. But anyway, we're excited tonight. We're going to have Steve Perry has offered to help us through one of the, a great book, but what a complex reading is Niebuhr's book on Christ and Culture. Jim Lincoln mentioned a book to us a while back, and I thought, okay, well, that'd be a good book to address. And as we started looking at it, I realized that, I really, being dyslexic, this isn't a book for dyslexic people. So I was able to go on, based on Brenda's recommendation, go online to some website, Internet Archives, it's called, downloaded the book, and they'll read it to you. I signed up for a handicap reading, and so it actually works. So they can read the book to me. Only problem is it reads every single word, including the footnotes at the bottom of each page.
Hey, you finally admitted that you needed help, that you're handicapped. That's pretty good.
Well, I haven't admitted it, I just acknowledged. But I'm a high-achieving dyslexic person. So if Krista Lincoln was on, she could empathize with me. So, but anyway, what an interesting book. It's really interesting that sometimes we maybe need to stretch a little bit and do some more reading than we normally are accustomed to. And when I do that, I realize how little I really know. And someone like Niebuhr, he writes stuff that even when I'm listening to it, I want to stop and take notes because it's like, that's really good stuff. And then just when I think I understand it, then I realize all he's doing is summarizing ideas. And then I go, oh my gosh, I don't know which idea am I supposed to be recognizing? So when I called Steve, I said, Steve, we need someone who has the ability to look at lots of words, ideas, and maybe consolidate them for us so that we can actually pretend that we've read the book in full and understand it. So to be able to dialogue would be awesome about the concepts that are here, because I think they're real helpful. And as I went through, I started thinking, and Jim mentioned this a while back, this book was written back in the late 40s, early 50s. And yet it's very relevant in terms of today. And really you wonder how in the world can you live your Christian life and not be familiar with all the varieties of ways that you can view ideas and how these ideas have changed, some through history and through time. And so I think really, there's Brady Buchanan jumping in. So I think it's been a really interesting read. I haven't even finished the book, but I have started it several times with my audio reader. And because it takes me about 2 or 3 times of hearing something before I get it and start to understand it. So I feel really good about it. I did read something which I thought I'll start with, and then we'll reintroduce Steve. But Niebuhr did, like on page 37, he did a long paragraph, and I'm just going to read it a little bit because I think it gives you the idea of really, or just something to be considering. He says, talks about conservation of values, and he says their houses, their schools, their temples, their roads, machines stand in constant need of repair. He said the desert and the jungle threaten every cultivated acre. Even greater are the dangers of the decay of the less material achievements of the past. The systems of laws and liberties and the customs of social intercourse, the methods of thought, the institutions of learning and religion, the techniques of art, of language, and morality itself. These cannot be conserved by keeping and repair the walls and documents that are their symbols. They need to be written afresh, generation by generation, on the tablets of the heart. He said, let education and training lapse for one generation in the whole grand structure of past achievement falls into ruin. And I thought, wow, what an interesting idea. That that things that we live can be very very shortly unlived. And what we pass on, I think, even as Christians, and how we understand Christendom and how we pass on that thinking is equally as important. So anyway, that was what I saw in that little paragraph. And so welcome, Brady Buchanan. I'm assuming that's you or Emily, both, maybe. Thank you all for joining in tonight. So Steve Perry, most everyone here has heard from him. He's been gracious with his time, has spoken to us on a number of occasions, particularly on Sunday. And Steve is just, Steve is one of those, I think, really brilliant people who, why he has isolated himself out in Sweetwater, Texas, away from the general population, I have no idea, but we were fortunate enough to get him to interact with us via Zoom. And so we are really privileged to have Steve with us tonight. And I've asked him to spend 2 weeks to help us kind of share some summary thoughts on the book Christ and Culture by Richard Niebuhr. And so let's go ahead and get started. Jay, I'm going to ask, would you mind opening us in prayer this evening? And then we'll turn it over to Steve here. Yeah, go ahead.
Lord, I thank you for this evening. Thank you that we get to be together. Lord, I ask that you help us understand our culture today through this book, and that you can help us just connect ideas and see how they are playing out in our worlds today, so that we can know how to minister to other people, and that we can be of one mind and be united in our minds and in our striving toward you. Thank you for this time, Lord. In your gracious name I pray. Amen.
Thank you, Jay, for introducing us with prayer. Steve Perry, I'm going to turn over the floor to you. Now, some of y'all, when you're watching, let me ask you this. Are you seeing everybody in a box, or do you see the main speaker taking up the whole screen? If you're seeing everybody in a box, when a person like Steve starts talking, you can click the speaker view on your Zoom top right, usually, and that will highlight whoever's speaking, and you'll see them in full face. So sometimes it's good to get a close-up of Steve. He's got such a dynamic presence about him. Plus he has all his original hair and color, which is, I don't understand that. Okay, but yet he does. But so Steve, I'm gonna switch screens over to you. I do have the book standing by. If you want to refer to any pages, I'm welcome to do that. Or if you have that ability to do it on your own, if you think there's a need, be aware we can do that. So Steve Perry from Sweetwater, Texas. Are you there, Steve?
Yeah.
Okay. You have the floor.
Well, thank you, Rich. I'm happy to join you and to talk with Niebuhr's book and just the general ideas of about culture and the church. As a matter of fact, there's so many good associations that were raised when I first began examining this topic. That's you know where to begin or what to share with you about them. But culture, as you know, is something that we live in. As a matter of fact, it's hard to define culture, but if you look at the word itself, it's an agricultural metaphor. It comes from the word to cultivate. When I grew some bacteria in the lab many years ago as a freshman student, we mixed up what were called a culture, and we could grow bacteria in it. Of course, by metaphorically, it has become to mean the environment that we live in, and it's something that even though it's hard to define, we readily and easily recognize cultural events. Differences. If any of you've moved around, we're all from different, seem to be speaking from different cities. Even Sweetwater, as I sort of facetiously refer to it as the Mayberry of West Texas, has its own distinctive culture. And if you live here for a while, you begin to notice that it's not exactly like say San Marcos, or certainly not like Austin, and not like Chicago or South Dakota or Pittsburgh or Jackson, Mississippi, places that I've lived with my family. You begin to pick up differences that people there are, they're regional cultural differences. And not to mention the fact that if you've been overseas, if you've been into a foreign country, you know that those differences can be very significant. Matter of fact, that they can be so overwhelming that there's a common phenomenon once you move to a new culture, and after you've been there for a few months and you've gotten over the newness of it, you experience something called culture shock. And it's very real. And feelings are very similar to depression, and it's simply being overwhelmed by all of the little differences in the way people do things, in the way people think, the assumptions that they have, and the mind just becomes overwhelmed with having to make so many decisions. Once you live in a culture and you're familiar with it, you absorb the rules, so to speak, and you don't even have to think about right ways of doing stuff, of how to stand in a line or make change in a grocery store, or things like that. One of the starkest cultural differences that I know of that my family has experienced, my daughter Stephanie, when she was a teenager in high school, she went to on a missions trip to Papua New Guinea. And I had scarcely heard of the place at the time, but she goes on a mission trip and takes a canoe ride up the Sepik River, 3 days on a canoe with outboard motors. And they come to a little village that had been evangelized by a Wycliffe missionary by the name of Marilyn Laszlo. And Marilyn makes this film about the experience of evangelizing this tribe that was not only isolated from Christianity, but was isolated from most of the rest of the world. And but the thing that struck me is interesting about it is I'm watching the video, and towards the end they were all gathered together in an open air pavilion, singing one of the hymns that they had written and were playing on their native instruments. Looked like long pieces of bamboo that were wind and percussion instruments, to the tune of one of the old Doobie Brothers songs. And that struck me as a little odd to see that so starkly juxtapositioned. And I thought, well, this would be, this is one of they would be playing it on one of those ancient tribal melodies, But they were wearing T-shirts with slogans on them, and that they had appropriated, which is apparently a bad thing to do these days, certain elements of Western culture. And but the challenge of Erin Laszlo was to take what she thought was the essence of the gospel and to be able to translate it in symbols and words, since she was writing an alphabet for the language, was to capture the essence of Christianity and convey it to these people. And she had some problems doing that, challenges. For instance, they didn't have bread, and you know, in their society they made something similar to it out of sago paste, which was from a root of some plant, native plant. And this was kind of the closest substitute. This was the dynamic equivalent. And there were many such decisions that needed to be made to transfer the meaning of Christianity into symbols and artifacts that that the tribe was familiar with and would be familiar with them. This is something, this cross-cultural division is something very familiar to any missionary, people who've done mission work. And Don Richardson, you may have heard of, who was popular a number of years, 20 years ago when we were in seminary, had written a book called Peace Child, and Eternity Within Their Hearts was another one, and was essentially on the challenges of getting Christianity translated into various and different cultures. And this is nothing new, even though that there may not have been a word for the concept. The concept was alive, even in the New Testament. You remember that in the book of Acts, there was a division that arose between the Greek-speaking Christians, Jewish Christians, and the Aramaic-speaking Christians in Jerusalem over distribution of, or the widows there. The Greek-speaking Jews who had converted to Christianity were called Hellenistikoi, the Hellenist Jews, and they were distinct from the Hellenes, the Greeks. That is, that there were Jews who were Greek-like. They were not Greeks by birth, but they were Greek-like in the sense that they had appropriated and embraced Greek ways of doing stuff. They spoke the Greek language. They dressed the way that Greeks dressed, and they probably ate. And, they went to the baths and all the things that the Greeks did. And Alexander himself was on a mission to Hellenize the ancient Near East in his conquest back in the 4th century BC. So it's a contact, it's a problem that people have been aware of, cultural differences for a long time. And dealing with them was a question relating to various cultures. How to relate to them was a question that interested Richard Niebuhr. He was a sociologist and was very influenced by two German sociologists, Max Weber and Ernst Troeltsch. And Max Weber, of course, was famous for writing a book on, I think it was called The Spirit of the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And Ernst Troeltsch wrote a book about the sociology of churches as well. There was an old joke that was told by I believe it, the sage of Baltimore, H.L. Mencken, about that. It escapes me who I read it in recently, but the story goes that a group of Baptists went out and they were evangelizing and asking people to come to church, and they came to a rather poor family, and they invited them to church, and the family said, well, you know, we'd be embarrassed because we don't have any shoes or any nice clothes. And so they went out and said, well, we'll get you some shoes and some nice clothes. And of course, next week they didn't show up at church. So they come back to find out, well, why didn't they come to church? You know, he says, well, they said, well, you bought us some really nice clothes. So we went to the Presbyterian church. And that it was an observation that that many people have made, that the denominations in this country are socially stratified. A Methodist is a Baptist who's graduated from high school and wears shoes, and a Presbyterian is a Methodist that's been to college and so forth. You get the idea. And but anyway, the point I'm making in these kinds of ramblings, I'm hoping I'm just gently poking the bear and not stepping on anyone's toes here. Is that culture is important to us, and it's like if we were fish, it would be like the water that we swim in, and we've become so accustomed to it that it's hardly recognizable until we're taken out of our environment and thrust into a new environment, and we learn new things. Learning the task of learning a new language is a great way of getting a window into the essence or the soul of a different culture. Well, enough of that. And back to Niebuhr. That was, I'll try to stay somewhat focused on this, this task of what Niebuhr did. And I'm going to try and to keep us out of the weeds. That is, Niebuhr's book is a rather dense book. And we've been well served by a number of people, particularly on the web, who have made some interesting and illustrative charts of his book, and as a chart, it's pretty close to a picture. It can be had pretty powerful explanatory force about it. And so I went around and looked for different charts that would lay out what we call a taxonomy. Now, taxonomy is a word that's dear to librarians and other social scientists. It means laying things out in order. And it's sort of what a zoologist or a biologist does. They create taxonomies. And that is, they put things in groups of families and phylums and species and so forth, so that you could see the relationship of each one of them to the other. And I think Niebuhr says that one of the reasons he wrote his book is that he wanted to sort out and understand where he stood as far as his own view of culture, and it was sort of an exercise in self-understanding for him. Are you with me so far? Am I just okay? Let me throw out what I thought was one of the better charts, and that lays out Niebuhr's taxonomy or paradigms. And let me see if this can work. Let's see. Can you see that?
Yes.
What do you see?
Getting typed according to Richard Niebuhr.
That's right. Getting typed. And let's see if I can. Yeah, okay. It reminds me of the old story about, you remember who was the guy that led the Donner Pass party and was convicted of cannibalism? You remember who that was?
Well,
What was his name? Packer. And I think they named a cafeteria after him at the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley. Their motto was "Have a friend for lunch." And well, anyway, Packer was at that time was the only man who had ever been convicted of cannibalism in the United States. And he was asked after he was given the verdict, he said what he thought about it, and he says, "One lousy foot and you're a cannibal for life." And so that's what getting typed is. You know, you don't want to be confined yourself to one category, but it is helpful to enable our understanding of these different stances of Christians towards culture. And Niebuhr divides them into two basic categories. One he calls the extreme types, and the other are the more conventional, the mediating types. And the terms you're probably already familiar with is, if you can read it, it's Christ against culture. And in parentheses, it's a rejection of culture. The Christ of culture, it's an assimilation of culture. Christ above culture, synthesis, Christ and culture and paradox, and Christ the transformer of culture. The stance of Christ against culture, as it says, it's a rejection of culture. It's Christianity and culture in opposition to each other. Some of the historical representatives were Tertullian and Tolstoy. Tertullian famous said, "What does Jerusalem have to do with Athens?" And he was very much opposed to classical learning and the teaching of the classical myths. Tolstoy was a bit of a nut, I think. He lost it late in life, and he was a brilliant writer. Late in life, he decided he wanted to become a peasant and to live among the peasants. He had very romantic notions about what being a peasant was, and his rationale was doing that was to living a more simple and Christ-like life, a life in imitation of Christ. So he is a historical representative of Christ against culture. Examples are the monastic and the sectarian groups. Is the expression the Benedict option a term that any of you are familiar with? And Rod Drewer, I think, believes as a columnist, has written about the Benedict option. And he says his stance is that culture has gotten so bad that we need to do what the Irish did during the Dark Ages, and that is to preserve a semblance of Christian culture is that we need to retreat to monasteries and preserve the great text of the Bible and the church fathers, for one thing. And those who follow the idea of Benedict to live monastically and to preserve their culture as a subculture, saying that this has become a necessity because the culture that we live in is so adversarial to us as Christians that survival dictates that there's no other option for us. Some of these sectarian groups, of course, include the Amish, and less so the Mennonites, who are more accommodating. What's a Mennonite? It's not like a Baptist who wears shoes, but it's an Amish who has a telephone and will actually drive cars. But where you draw the exact line is sometimes difficult. They had a seminary in Goshen, Indiana, and one of the things we did as seminary librarians, we'd get together and talk shop every summer. We'd make something of a vacation out of it. And I remember at one of our dinners, I sat down next to this librarian from this Mennonite seminary in Goshen, and in my inimicable, gracious way, I said, "Now, the Mennonites of your seminary, are they from the black bumper or the chrome bumper group?" And since there was a very famous split among the Mennonites up in Elkhart, Indiana, on whether or not it was appropriate to have chrome on your automobile bumper or not, whether that was too ostentatious or not. It was a cultural thing, you know, and the Amish and the Mennonites were very careful about appropriating modern culture. But that's the Christ and culture. John Howard Yoder is one of the exponents of this. He is from the Anabaptist and the Amish and Mennonite tradition. Another one is a fellow from our part of the country, I guess. When I say our, he was probably one of the more famous graduates of Southwestern University in Georgetown, a fellow by the name of Stanley Hauerwas, who teaches at Duke University, so Yale PhD. And I'll come back and visit some of his ideas later on, hopefully. And he's written a book called Resident Aliens, which is a fleshing out of this, how to live as Christians as a counterculturalist. So that's Christ against culture. It's a rejection of, by and large, of worldly culture. As a matter of fact, it views, when John writes about the world, and I think Niebuhr points this out, that he's it's roughly equivalent to what we call culture. That is, non-Christian culture is usually labeled as or typed as the world. Any questions? Are we moving at a good pace here? Okay.
One observation, Steve. As I look through all the particular groups that he presents, and what I was finding myself is that either we've moved in and out of these without realizing that we're doing. It's like a house with multiple rooms. You're moving in and out of the rooms. And I guess what I found myself trying to figure out better is I didn't realize I was doing that. That there were people I knew that there were people living monastic lives, and I mean, I recognized that. I just never saw them as, I could never identify them differently. I just knew they were different. I just didn't know why, and I could never figure out why it seemed like sometimes I would be that way. I would be in that room and I could be that way for a while, then I would change rooms. And I don't know if that's a normal thing or not, but it was helpful as I started just identifying with Niebuhr's book, going, okay, yeah. And I found myself going, yeah, I think I'm with that. No, I'm with this one. You know, as I found myself kept switching.
Yeah,
I've been exposed to a lot of them. And
you could think too in terms of the church has changed in its relationship to its surrounding culture, as these types indicate, and the changes are sometimes dependent upon the circumstances, the historical circumstances at the time and in the place. For instance, when I lived in Mississippi, and I was a dean at college there, the president once made a remark about how culturally that since it was a Christian school and fairly conservative, that they had a lot of wind in their sails from the local culture that allowed them to be more accommodating and participate more in local cultural events that were wholesome and family friendly, as opposed to, say, if you were in the Pacific Northwest, and where you would find yourself that the opposition that you would feel as an evangelical Christian, if you were so labeled, it would be palpable. You would feel the people sort of getting their feathers ruffled or their fur against you instinctively, and that would necessitate a different way of navigating in these cultural waters, so to speak. But that's essentially a culture, a creation of a subculture, Christ against culture. And there are lots of subcultures, youth subcultures. Theodore Roszak, many years ago, wrote a famous book called The Making of a Counterculture, which was the rise of hippiedom back in the 1960s, which was, in a way, very similar to Christianity. It was a rejection of this typology of Christianity. Was a rejection of the established hegemonic culture. Timothy Leary, you remember Timothy Leary? He's dead now, and but he was a famous professor at Harvard University who went around preaching the gospel of LSD, and his message was it turn on, tune in, drop out, and dropping out of and rejecting the establishment, which was what amounted to what we would call respectable or conventional middle class bourgeoisie society. So that's Christ against culture, and that is Niebuhr labels as an extreme type. The second type is Christ of culture, whereas it's just these two are mirror opposites of each other. Whereas one rejects culture, the other is an assimilation of culture, and that, well, as the stance here is Christ, and the highest expressions and aspirations of culture are in agreement. I took a classics course once, and we were reading Plato, and the fellow was saying, Plato was the nearest thing to being a Christian you could be in the ancient pagan world without any knowledge of Christ. And that Plato and Christ were, you know, they were kind of like this, that they were fundamentally saying the same things. The examples that Niebuhr gives here, and this is where you really get off into the weeds, are Basilides and Valentinus rather, which are Gnostics. And you say, well, that doesn't mean much to me. What the heck is that? You know. The examples he gives us are the cultural Protestantism of the 19th century. And the closest example I can think of that I recall reading an article about, I think it was a Wikipedia article about the Prime Minister, I guess it's Prime Minister of Italy. And under, you know, and they off in the box on the side, it lists, you know, things like religion, date of birth, and so forth. Well, under religion, it listed cultural Christian. And of course, it was a hot link. You just could link on to cultural Christian. You said, well, what is a cultural Christian? And essentially, those Christians, people who sympathize with the Christian tradition, but they don't believe all that miracle stuff, you know, and Jesus may not have been in existence or not. And but that, you know, that like a good Jew, they always get drunk on Purim and go to synagogue on the high holidays, and a cultural Christian will do the same. They'll go to Christmas Eve service at the church, you know, and they'll give Christmas gifts and that sort of thing. They recognize and they appreciate, especially the music. I mean, there's the great Baroque music of the 15th century and later. It just, you know, they love it. It's beautiful. Why not appreciate it? And they see this melding of culture and Christianity in a way which pretty much dilutes Christianity. There's nothing particular, especially biblical, about our attempt to be orthodox in adherence to the creeds or the confessions or anything like that. We could probably also put on this spectrum something called liberation theology. That's a term you're probably familiar with. And basically that's a variety of Marxism that has been heavily promoted by Catholic priests in Central and South America. And basically it's a assimilation of the ideas of Marx and, you know, helping the oppressed and bringing about a more equitable economic world by appropriating the methods and the goals, making the goals of Marxism and substituting them for evangelism. And that would be liberation theology. Seemed to me like there's some other examples of that. Yes, there is.
Steve, you're saying that is an example of Christ of assimilation?
Yes, it's assimilating, making the cultural values
As the other.
are the ones that become predominant.
But in the 18th, you know, in the 19th century, the Protestant group were trying to change their culture to, you know, positive, you know, trying to make it more like Christ would want it with their, you know, that's when all the hospitals and missions and everything went going forward. So I'm just trying to see how those compare together.
That's a good point, and I think it is relevant. You take, for instance, you're familiar with an institution called the YMCA,
Right.
and the YMCA is no longer called the YMCA, right? They've dropped the Christian and the men's from the YMCA, and it's just the Y now, and it's just become a rather a do-goodish, social program that has lost any kind of a. It is just a very tenuous identity with its Christian origins, which were very strongly evangelistic in the beginning, and there is in looking at any kind of typology like this, you see things that don't always, you wonder where they fit. And the explanatory power of a typology, a taxonomy, is, of course, its ability to have a place for every group, every phenomenon, every individual. And there will be some limitations here, but I think one of the reasons why Niebuhr's typology has worn well is it has pretty good explanatory value. There are different ways of looking at a Christian and the church's relationship with culture, and I'm going to propose one of mine myself if we ever get to that point. Which I think is, well, has its own value as a means of explanation, and it achieves what Rich and I are looking for, and that is a way of putting the cookies on the bottom shelf so that we can all reach them, right? Isn't that what Kaiser used to say? Putting the cookies on the bottom shelf. Well, any questions of Christ and culture? When I mention these things, there is a parallel universe here that we could also be talking about as well, because Christians are not the only ones who struggle with the problem of relating to culture and enculturation and assimilation. Who's the other group?
The other group that struggles with culture?
Yes, in a way that Christians do. I mean, we are the ones that seem to be obsessing with this, but there's also another group that obsesses with it as well, and has for a long time, and that is the Jews. And we're going to make some comparisons between the Jewish approach, and because they're very careful about guarding their culture. Was it Rev Tevye was when he was singing about tradition? You remember Rev tradition, and all that. And it was a tale about his relationship with culture. In other words, the tradition was a cultural tradition that he was wrestling with. You remember, and particularly the issue was marriage and intermarriage, and at some point his youngest daughter ran off and married a Gentile, and that's where he had to draw the line, somewhere in terms of assimilation. But in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, the Jews, particularly in Germany, wrestled wrestled with this problem of assimilation, and whether or not they were going to, what they wanted to do is and they saw as a liability to themselves, and they argued about this incessantly, is our Jewish identity is a problem, and we become persecuted for it. And what we need to do is we need to assimilate into German culture. We need to adapt German models of professional experience and education, and assimilate ourselves in the highest levels of German societies, and even intermarry, that is. And it was, according to Hitler anyway, and his brown shirt, it was something that they didn't want Jews to do. They didn't want them to assimilate into German culture. And of course, on the other end of the extreme were the Hasidic Jews and the Zionists, who were, talk about Christ against culture, they were Jews against culture, right? And they wanted to form their own communities. They all wanted to dress the way they wanted to dress, and they would live in their own neighborhoods and send their kids to their own schools, and they became kind of a quaint curiosity, you know. And even today, and if you go to Jerusalem, there, I'm trying to think of the neighborhood. It's been 30 years since I've been there, but Ein Korean, I think. But even they are set off and distinctive from Israeli Jews who view their Jewishness as an ethnicity rather than a religion. And so, like I say, there are examples within other groups, and groups that have tried to preserve their cultural heritage and identity. I'm told, for instance, what the Irish say about Irish Americans is that they're more Irish than we are. They hold on to Irish traditions, and they love the old Irish music, whereas people back in Ireland they've kind of moved on culturally speaking. So it's a vast subject, and it's important to lots of people, and for different reasons. But that's the Christ of culture, assimilationism, being totally immersed. It's sort of like when the two denominations of the Northern Presbyterians merged, the United Presbyterians and the Presbyterian Church of the U.S. merged to become the PCUSA. The United Presbyterian was the smaller denomination, and they were worried about merging with the larger PCUS, and they said, well, it's going to be like a big fish swallowing up a little fish, and that'll be the end of us. And that our distinctives as United Presbyterians, and they did have distinctions that were very different from the larger denomination. They had things like family altars, and they were very missionary conscious, and very pietistic, and practiced their religion much more conscientiously than the larger, more worldly Presbyterian denominations. And you know what? They were absolutely right. It did happen. And there are a few vestiges. You have to look carefully. You have to know what you're looking for. But you can't. But it's hardly there anymore. The old United Presbyterian strain. They had a few faculty members at PTS when I was library director there that were out of that tradition, and but they were a dying breed, and because they had been swallowed up by the tsunami forces of culture within the larger denomination. Are you still with me? Am I wearing you out here?
Yeah.
It reminds me of Star Trek's The Borg. If anybody's, resistance is futile. They just assimilated and transformed whoever it was, and they won, just like you were saying.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, those are the extreme types. And, but maybe one of them isn't quite as extreme as Mr. Niebuhr suggests. But if you want me to continue, we can go on and a pace here and look at these others three as well. And the next one is what he calls Christ above culture. And that is a synthetic approach to culture, and that views Christianity and its surrounding culture, pagan culture, whatever, non-Christian culture, is there are two things to be synthesized, to be reconciled and brought together. What does he say here? There's both continuity and discontinuity between Christ and the church. The early apologists, and Aquinas in particular, are historical representatives. Aquinas had his project, the Thomistic project. The great Thomistic project was a result of when the Muslims took over the eastern part of the empire, and there was this great exodus from Constantinople into the west, and they brought with them something that Western scholars had not been available to them, and these were the great documents of classical Greek and Rome, and in particular the writings of Aristotle. And Aristotle was a great systematician of philosophy in ancient Greece, as you well know. His arrival, Plato, and the school of Athens. And Aristotle was struck, you might say, by Aquinas was struck by Aristotle's philosophical abilities. And he used his philosophical categories to explain Christian doctrines, and wrote it up in a book called the Summa, which is a very important document in Catholic theology. But it was this project of taking the best of ancient culture and using it to synthesize and create a better understanding of the faith. Well, it was a project that was begun under Augustine in the 4th and 5th century, and his rationale for it was from the Bible and a passage regarding the Exodus, and it's where it says, and the Hebrew children spoiled the Egyptians. Remember, it said they took all their gold and silver and all of these valuable things. They plundered them, and as they left town. And Augustine said, "See, look there. We can't appropriate culture from the pagans." And that became sort of the rationale basis for doing that. And it, of course, represents as an example of the Catholic approach to tradition. And if the truth be known, if things known, that it was the emperor who was the Pontifex Maximus originally, right? And of course, Bishop of Rome appropriated that title himself. It was a synthesis, and much of probably the cult of worship that was developed there in terms of the liturgy, the hymns, the architecture. A lot of that was based Roman or pagan culture. As a matter of fact, a lot of the pagan temples were just converted into Christian churches as a symbol of this kind of synthesis. And of course, the Catholic Church and the way they've done missions over the years, this tendency has been evident. Remember, and what is it? In the cult of Virgin Mary, what is it? They're very different. There's a cult in Mexico, Virgin Mary, Saint Virgin Mary, Guadalupe.
Guadalupe.
Yeah, go something, I don't know. Pardon my ignorance. Yes.
When we lived in New Mexico, we visited, I guess it was up in Santa Fe, and we also talked about it a little bit in San Antonio when we visited the governor's palace, but we got to know some Indians on one of the pueblos in New Mexico because they worked with my husband on a project, or he worked with them, I guess would be the way. And so on Christmas Day, they would have dances, the buffalo dance, which is really a prayer to the Great Spirit for good hunting and stuff. And it was an interesting dance to see with all the different parts to it and stuff. But we said, how in the world did y'all keep this from being allowed to do this? And he said, oh, we just figured out, we just told him we were doing it for baby Jesus.
That is
so they didn't.
It's called synthesis, but
they didn't get rid of. They didn't get rid of the other stuff. They just added Jesus to what they already had.
It's syncretistic, joining together of the spirit traditions that are not maybe even antithetical to each other. It's kind of a joining of superstition and paganism with Catholic belief and practice. And the church has been very accommodating, Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church, in its missional enterprises in doing that sort of thing. Throw them a bone. I don't know. But any questions about that?
Yeah, Steve, I have one question. When we talk about the early apologists, I think of apologists like modern apologists, but sorry, ambulance going by. I think of apologists like I do today and modern apologists. Are you making some comparison when you say, when he writes there in your notes, early apologist? Is that simply mean, how are you using the word apologist? I think of someone, a defender of the faith or something like that.
Yeah, Jim could probably tell you more about this than I could, but people like Tertullian and Justin Martyr, and those are only two that spring to mind right now. But they wrote formal apologies in defense of Christianity, like I think Justin Martyr wrote to the emperor. That there were, and that the apologetic approach that they took was that things like, Christianity was foretold not just in the Bible, but in, say, Homer, and in the Greek myths. Seemed to me like who was the guy? Caesarea, the historian.
Yeah, Tertullian and Origen were both.
Who was Constantine's historian of Caesarea? Old age is catching up with me here. But it was an apologetic too. His history was apologetic, and that the belief was that there was the preparation for the gospel was all of what happened, like the Greek Empire, not the Greek, but the Roman Empire, was providential preparation for the spread of the gospel. And they didn't view Greek and Roman culture as entirely negative thing. They viewed it in a positive way as preparation for the gospel.
Philo was a Jewish apologist.
Yes. And of course, he was trying to reconcile Judaism with Greek and pagan philosophy as a Neoplatonist. Well, that's Christ above culture, Roman Catholicism. How are we doing on time? Am I exhausted?
I think if we are going to try to do it in 2 weeks is probably a good pausing point, maybe to ask some additional questions. I guess as I look at that, I mean, this chart sort of helps simplify, and yet I still find myself kind of almost now a little more confused in terms of, I guess I'm really impacted by my experience in Christianity being from being an American and being a Christian in America. And I think I don't have as much an appreciation, though I should. I was a sociology major, but I should have. I find a bit of a disconnect. So, like Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof, I mean, he understands his Judaism from the culture being in this Russian village. And you realize how impacted you are when the culture starts changing around you. You know, what are the things you're holding to? And so one of the things I want to appreciate from this particular study is just that. What are the things that that I need to be holding to, and how do I differentiate that from the impact that the culture I live in, you know, if that makes sense, and maybe a little confusing.
Well, maybe this would make a good place to pause. And then the two remaining mediating types will probably be more familiar to you, cultural approaches. And we can look at those in maybe next Wednesday night and talk about my own typology. And that way we will really do some mystifying.
Unless anyone else has some additional questions, this would be a great time to pause and ask, or if there's some clarity you'd like to see, maybe going forward. Anybody have a comment or a thought they want to inject?
Yeah, Rich, I do. As evangelicals, our final authority for faith and practice is the scriptures. So what I'd like to maybe play with or see in the list is, what would these views, what scripture would each of these views use to defend its position? And I could, on the first one, Christ against culture, and Benedictine option, they appeal to several scriptures to defend this position. Paul says, "Be ye separate," the idea of holiness. And so the question is not really either or. The question is what you asked, Rich: how much and where? Because clearly there are admonitions to be separate and not to assimilate in much of the pagan culture. But is that a strong enough admonition to move us to isolation instead of interaction? So I mean, I think it would be a good exercise to hear scripture, what scriptures, you know, or is it a moving target? Like Steve said, maybe maybe when you're in persecution by the culture, maybe you just don't have the option to join the culture. So, you know, maybe it's a moving target. But I'd like to think about scripture as an evangelical and what does it say about these options?
Yeah, 'cause I can see a verse for almost every one we've covered so far. And that's what I'm saying. It's sort of a little bit confounding me is that I'm finding myself, I mean, even with reading Niebuhr's book, I'm finding, I'm going like, yeah, what the heck do we do? How are we participating in culture? And then yet, you know, you find yourself looking at another verse and it seems to suggest that you're to transform culture, you know? And so, I don't, but that would be great to maybe look at some verses like that too.
I mean, if I have it right, the Essenes in the time of before Christ, but time of Christ, the Essenes pulled out. And they just thought as I understand it, they thought the Jews cooperating with Herod to build the temple, they sacrificed so many things to work with him. They just pulled out and said no, and they developed their own community in Qumran. So you can see it's tempting, but are there scriptures that would suggest that is that would be disloyal to our calling? Yeah.
Good points.
Yeah, I do want to, maybe we'll get, we'll do that. The thing that Niebuhr doesn't do, or he doesn't do overtly, and one of the things he's been criticized for is, you know, he does this analysis and he writes his conclusion in postscript, but he really doesn't come out and say, here's where I fit, you know, that sort of thing. Although he doesn't criticize one particular view. But yes, that's the one thing that is something of a weakness of his that has been partly rectified by D.A. Carson's book. That he writes a book called Christ and Culture Revisited, I believe. And yeah, I read that this past week, and it was generally insightful, but I think he had a little problem staying on target. But he wanted to talk mostly about postmodernism. Yeah, Niebuhr has been criticized a lot, and that's been something that I've read in more than one place. But he doesn't come out and say. In other words, his work is not prescriptive; it is descriptive. And he's just saying, "Well, this is the way it is, and not this is the way it should be." But hopefully, I get into that. Two things I want to look at is the basis for a scriptural basis for Christian interaction with the culture. That's one thing, and the other thing, besides finishing up these two different approaches, and the other thing is to make my own topology, taxonomy, which is based on a completely different metaphor altogether. But I think you'll find it, you may not find it persuasive, but you'll find it interesting and hopefully amusing. Okay.
Look forward to that. Thank you, Steve. This has been a great.
Rich, could you send me the link to your?
Repeat that.
Could you send me the link to your Niebuhr's PDF?
Yeah, I will do that.
Thank you.
Actually, Brenda, you probably could do it better than me. You have Steve's email.
Do I have what?
Can you put in the chat box your email and I'll send it to you. It's on Internet Archive. You have to create a free account and then you can borrow the book for 14 days, but you can keep rechecking it out.
Okay. Internet Archives, I can remember.
Yeah, you should be able to find it. Just, but I can send you the link. I just need. I could put it in the chat box, I guess. Would that be helpful to put it there?
Do that. I'll leave the broadcast still going until everyone's off. That way, everyone who wants to try to find that can do it. So you have it listed?
I'm looking it up. Hang on.
Okay.
Now, was the chart, Steve, was that from your research that you had done?
I posted that also. I found it.
Oh, you found the chart that we had up?
I posted that on GroupMe. I think it's the same one. It looks exactly the same.
Okay.
All you guys are on GroupMe, I think they can check it on there. Steve did a great job just getting us through the, in terms of summarizing what we're doing, which is really what we needed to do, because if you're going into an area like this without a background, it's hard to know, it's nice to have some pegs that you can sort of hang your hat on as you move through the book. It makes it a little easier. So thank you so much for that. But anybody else have a question you want to do? Otherwise, we'll go ahead and end the broadcast, or we're doing officially. I think it was a great evening. I think Jim putting us onto this as something to be considering is real helpful. I think we are, particularly now, obligated to understand, the culture that we are currently in light of just things that are occurring. And I think it helps us prepare better. In terms of just modern apologists, I guess we need to be, but it helps us prepare better to understand what Christianity has done in the past and how it's moved through history. And I can't, maybe the word mature is not the correct word, but maybe that's what I'm trying to describe. So I'm anxious to understand that better and be able to discuss it a little bit better with other people. So anybody else? We're recording the broadcast. I know a number of people wanted to get on, it couldn't, so they'll be able to watch the rebroadcast on there. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and close. And Brady Buchanan, are you still with us? I can't tell. You're probably doing two things. He's probably doing work and listening to us. So are you still alive, Brady?
Yes, I am.
You mind give us a short prayer to close us out tonight?
Not at all. Dear Lord, I thank you for this opportunity and for Steve and his walking us through some difficult but necessary discussions as we attempt to, in a way, reconcile how the church and how we as believers are to interact with the culture and not let the culture interact with us and our belief in you and what that looks like and how that plays out. I'm grateful for everyone here and that we're at a church that is willing to take on these topics and in love and ultimately with the desire to glorify you. I pray for everyone and their health and for Norm and Suzanne. It's your name I pray, amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. Again, guys, I'll keep the, did you post something there in the chat deal, Brenda? Okay.
Yes, it should be the link.
Check the link there, and I'll stay on a couple of minutes. We'll go ahead and officially end the broadcast, but stay on a couple of minutes there for y'all who want to gather that. So thank you all for being here.